In this video, David Roberts, an associate professor and director for the Urban Studies program at the University of Toronto, did a presentation discussing about Moss Park's history regarding to its urban development challenges it experienced in the past, critiquing the More Moss Park project and its dependency in philanthropy and the lack of community engagement on that matter. He advocates for community-led methods to the future improvement of the neighborhood and emphasizes the importance of urban planning that prioritizes public investments that leads to the betterment and benefit for all residents. Now let's continue to the video to see what else he has to discuss.
So we'll start the formal kind of talk portion in 5 minutes, but I'll say a little bit about who I am and the work that I do. So I'm David. I'm a professor in the Urban Studies program at U of T. My life before coming to graduate school was in social services. So I managed a shelter for homeless and refugee youth in the Seattle area for a number of years right after undergrad. And one of the things that I noticed in that work was that I was doing work on an individual basis. So I was working with individual youth and addressing their challenges and trying to get them back on their feet. But I wasn't doing work at a systemic level. So the kind of situations, the forces, the conditions that created this this influx or quite a substantial population of homeless youth in Seattle were not being addressed by my work at the shelter. That's not to say that emergency shelter work isn't necessary. It just was frustrating because I was putting Band-Aids on real problems that are much more expansive than what we could do working with individual clients. So I came to graduate school. I came to Toronto and graduate school. I'm going to date myself. In 2006, and studied urban geography. And what I was interested in thinking about there is how do communities mobilize to improve their overall conditions as a community rather than just as individuals. And part of what I was interested in and what I'm still interested in is how do individuals and communities that have been historically left out of urban planning processes, left out of city building, especially formal forms of city building. So, deputizing the planning offices, being hired as planners, being elected as city councilors. How do they continue to build community even as they've been historically marginalized? And how, on the flip side, how might planning processes be better and listen better to the communities who have been historically left out? So this work comes from that, right? I live in Moss Park. I live just a bit south of the park at Richmond and Sherbourne. And I started studying Moss Park before I actually moved into the neighborhood. So I started studying Moss Park in 2014 because I was interested in what was then called More Moss Park. And I'll talk about that in a bit. In terms of the planning exercise to reimagine and revitalize the park that's at the center of the community. So I studied that for 2014 through, 2016 and 17 when it just sort of disappeared. And I'll talk about that again in this talk as well. And then I joined the Moss Park Coalition a couple of years ago, which is where I'll end up the talk on. And that's a coalition of people who are interested in Moss Park and interested in improving the conditions of the lives of people who live, work, play, exist in Moss Park, but not from a top-down, like we need to develop it and redevelop it and gentrify it, but rather a collective sort of response to the urban change that is happening in the neighborhood. And luckily, I've been able to work with Soraya and the folks here in various capacities for, almost 10 years now, in our work with the Urban Studies program. We have a pretty deep partnership with the work that's being done here at TCL&D, so I jumped on the opportunity to give a talk.
Yeah, thank you. So thank you, David. And this is, like, as you mentioned, the partnership since the center was open. A part of the institution has to come to the community. So which the RISE and U of T, one of them, the partner bringing the course to the center. One of the courses that we had it last year as well, how we could evaluate course, or how do you engage, what is the gap that exists, how do we close the gap that why the community members are not engaged in the community. We finished that, and we're gonna have it in the fall. Ask Serious was happening since the center was open, and somehow we took gaps and breaks. And I said, David, can we start again? So and I said, yeah, let's start from David. It was last month, I think. It was my daughter was doing her thesis. Her supervisor was Edith. She presented in 660 UN Pavilion. Then next month we're gonna have Edith herself. We will have ongoing every month Ask a Serious topics. If you have any ideas also, please go ahead and share with us. Yes.
Sorry, do you have a newsletter that we can subscribe to?
Yes, yes. We have Anna from the staff that you could give her your contact.
Okay.
There is registration also that's going on. So maybe you could put your contact, and she would. She's the right person to put you on the list. And also next month, like I mentioned, Edith is on that, and the flyer I will pass it on if you want to sign up for her as well. And in June also, we invite a 51 division.
Okay.
There is a lot of stuff happening. I'm going to talk to you about that.
Sure.
And I spoke to the supervisor. The supervisor will be June 6th. He will be here as well to present the gap that exists with the community and 51 division as well. And we will have these talks throughout the year. When we start the course, we will take a break, but we have every month. That's one of the things that we've been doing, and we enjoy having them, and we learn so much on that. And I'm looking forward to learn about Moss Park as well. And Moss Park is kind of underserved in the city.
Yeah,
we have the city councilor, also representative here. So he will take that and tell his council. Yeah, thank you. Go ahead.
Yeah, same counselor, yeah. So what I'll talk about today is Moss Park. I'm sure most people are somewhat familiar with it, but I'll give a bit of context. I'll do a bit of a retrospective on the work that was being done in 2014 through 2016 with More Moss Park. And then I'll talk about the work of the Moss Park Coalition and what we're hoping to do over the next few years in terms of developing a more collective approach to urban development and neighborhood change in the area. So I start with this photograph because one, it gives you a sense of how long Moss Park has been the center of industry and industrial work. And as much as things have changed in the park, a lot of things have also stayed the same. So some of the buildings, not all of them, are still up. Some of them were taken down from the park itself. But essentially this is just a vision of the park, or a picture of the park from 1917. It's the oldest picture I could find. Moss Park was originally the center of industry within Toronto. So much of manufacturing and heavy and light industrial factories were in that neighborhood. The building that I live in, for example, was a spice factory originally in the 1920s, and then for much of its life, an eyeglass factory turned into condos in the 1990s. As a consequence, a lot of the infrastructure that's built there was built for factory workers, at least initially. So a lot of the housing was designed for single men and for other kind of factory work, and hasn't adapted nearly as much as the neighborhoods adapted. So as families have moved in, as children have moved in, we still have a neighborhood that infrastructure itself is designed for factory work. We know the factory work is largely gone from the city of Toronto. Manufacturing is largely gone from the city of Toronto, much like many cities throughout North America. Industrial work started to leave in the 1970s and has gone overseas largely. So we have this sort of gap between the existing built form infrastructure, the Moss Park Apartments being one example of that, and the types of people who live there, the types of life that exists within that. So that's one of the things to keep in mind. The other is, I'll do a few slides on demographics. And one of the things that we can notice about Moss Park difference between the rest of the city is there's less dependence, so there's less youth in general. There are higher rates of working age folks, and that tends to be the kind of age demographic, but we can also look at other sorts of demographics that perhaps give us even more interesting. I can read it to you. I'm unfortunately not sure.
That's okay.
Yeah, basically what this is saying, the first is the male to female ratio. Moss Park has a little bit higher men than women. And that has both a reflection of its history, but also a reflection of the TCHC properties that are there. And the biggest sort of difference that you would see is that children only make up about 7% of Moss Park, whereas the rest of the city, 14% of the population are children. But working age is 73% approximately in Moss Park versus 57% in the rest of the population. So the main difference is that it's largely a community of adults, not exclusively. But I think that in some ways reflects what the infrastructure that's there, right? It's less some strange circumstance of demographics that adults want to live in Moss Park or something like that, but more that the infrastructure that's there is largely built for single people, single adult people, rather than families.
Do most of the working people have jobs?
I wouldn't go that far. No, Moss Park has much higher unemployment rates, and I'll get to that in the next slide, than the rest of
This census is just for this year or just
This is a couple of years ago.
a couple of years?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yes, David, how old is Moss Park?
Moss Park, the park itself, was built.
No,
The neighborhood?
housing, yes.
Moss Park apartments were built in the 1950s, I believe. So in the 1950s, that would be still the height of industry in the city. So they were built for factory workers, essentially, rather than families. Here we start to get a sense of the racial demographics of Moss Park. So Moss Park, we are in a city that has majority of us were born outside of Canada. Moss Park reflects that as well. But it also reflects new immigrants in a way that other parts of the city don't. So it's slightly higher in terms of new immigrants. And this is just a breakdown in terms of where people were born. And it's not that interesting. It just is a kind of gives you a sense of the diversity. But the diversity exists throughout much of the neighborhoods in Toronto. So I don't think there's anything that stands out for me here. But when we start to think about other things in terms of what you mentioned around poverty or around unemployment, this is where Moss Park sort of stands out in terms of neighborhoods, especially in the downtown core. So at the time of this statistic measurement, so this is 2015, so it's a bit old, but we get these about every 10 years, so we're due for an update. Moss Park had a poverty rate of 30%, which is 11% higher than the city average. So significantly higher percentage of folks experiencing poverty. And I imagine since 2015, that's only increased, right? We've seen throughout the city an increased number of people experiencing poverty, and somewhat due to the pandemic, also due to inflation, also due to the affordability crisis, all kinds of different things. But there is a significant portion of folks in Moss Park who are under the poverty line. Part of that is also because of the concentration of social services within the neighborhood. So Moss Park has quite a few of the city's largest homeless shelters within the neighborhood. And there's a bit of a chicken and egg thing there, right? In some ways, that's a reflection of Moss Park has always been a poorer community or has historically been a poorer community. So social services set up there. But it's also a community that doesn't shy away from welcoming shelters. So these types of news reports that you see about new shelters attempting to open up in the beaches or the annex or something along those lines, and you see collective opposition by residents to them. We don't really see that in Moss Park in terms of the social services that are there. Part of the answer might be that people are just used to the fact that there are a lot of social services within the neighborhood that cater to folks experiencing poverty, cater to folks experiencing addiction, cater to folks who are precariously unhoused. And so a new one isn't all that big of a deal. But it may also signal some other sorts of communitarian values within the neighborhood that are a bit different than other places. Yeah.
When they had a proposal to put in, to take away, rebuild John Innes Community Center, the corner of Sherburne and Queen, there was a huge number of people came out to the meetings. But they were protesting that they were taking away from they were gentrifying the neighborhood. That would be the protest. But a lot of people wanted to know, what about the homeless? What about all the people who are benefiting from living right by the services? And so there's also the opposite kind of thing.
Yeah, absolutely. So I do think, there's a collective concern about gentrification. But what we're seeing, and I was at those consultations, or most of them, at the time of the last, in the more Moss Park era.
They are going to go ahead with it.
Eventually, yeah. Or at least I think so. I mean, the person behind you would know a little bit better. But the demographics are changing, though, in some ways, right? There are significant numbers of luxury or unaffordable condos that are being built up Sherborne, on Queen. There's a huge new development being built just south of the Moss Park Apartments. And the city, as much as they've tried, has not been able to mandate enough affordable housing in these units. So they'll largely be market rate or luxury. And so we saw in the 2015 consultations around the John Ennis that there were community members who were advocating for cleanup of the park or other sorts of interventions that might displace homeless or displace sex workers or drug users or whomever else the population was that people were fearful of. And the challenge with displacement is, where do they go, right? Like, where do people who are precariously housed, experiencing addiction, or in need of the social services that exist in the neighborhood, where do they end up? And that's never the kind of the part of that conversation when we're talking about cleaning a neighborhood up. So we do hear those conversations, but I think that in the neighborhood, there's a recognition that poverty is part of urban life, and that the solution isn't displacement, but rather trying to figure out ways to improve the conditions of people so that they might work themselves out of poverty or find other options, et cetera. One of the other things that I think is quite evident if you spent any time in the neighborhood is that it's underinvested in terms of park space, in terms of community centers, in terms of places for people to be during the day, all kinds of different things. There is an underinvestment, and I would argue that underinvestment is both on the private sector as well as the public sector in terms of the kind of things that knit a community together. So one of the things that I'll get to in the moment is that we've been doing a lot of work to learn from our neighbors in Regent Park, from our neighbors in Jane and Finch, from Thorncliffe, et cetera, about community organizing and community benefit agreements and things like that. But there's different infrastructures, social infrastructures that exist in those neighborhoods that allow for community development that we don't have in Moss Park that make it a little bit more challenging to do this work. So something like this community organization and the work that we do with them in terms of things like the course that Soraya mentioned, which is a community leadership course, there's not even a space to do that in Moss Park in any real way, because the only place, public space like that would be the John Ennis Community Center, also built in the 1950s, too small, overutilized, and lacking in the types of resources, and is a recreation center rather than a community center, so doesn't have the orientation towards community development that you might see in here or the Spectrum or other places in Jane and Finch and any other neighborhood. So it's lacking in a lot of community infrastructure, which makes doing this kind of work a lot more challenging.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Is that, so these kind of like series, is that a great tool to like share awareness to the people? Like what's the main goal? Right? Since this is community organizing, so the goal of this is to share awareness to the people so that people can mobilize and organize like what Regent Park have done. And, ask for community center or more stuff to be done in the community, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So the second part of the kind of conclusion of my talk, I'll talk more about the work of the Moss Park Coalition. The Moss Park Coalition is a group of individuals that are either live in the neighborhood or connected to the neighborhood in some way, who are advocating for those types of things, right? And what we are ultimately arguing is that all of this investment, there's a ton of public investment happening within the neighborhood, and there's a ton of private investment in the neighborhood, should be leveraged for community development, right? If you're going to invest in these things, it shouldn't just be for some future resident that you imagine to buy a market rate condo in the neighborhood, and it should be for the people who exist in the neighborhood now, with the acknowledgement that the density will continue to increase, that there'll be new people that come into the neighborhood, but they shouldn't. But the amenities shouldn't all just be designed for this future market rate resident. But it should also include thinking about the needs, the wants, the desires of the people who exist in Moss Park now. So we'll get there in just a moment. So as has come up quite a bit, in 2014, 2015 to 2017 or so, there was the first sort of big thinking process of how to revitalize the park and the community center called More Moss Park. And More Moss Park is an interesting thing. I've written about it. I can send you links to I can send you the PDFs of the articles I've written about it. More Moss Park was built around a public-private partnership, meaning that the idea was to leverage a donation by an anonymous private donor. I think it was somewhere in the magnitude of $30 million to redesign the park and to redesign the community center. Both are in fundamental need of redesign. The community center is 80 years old, something like that, and the park needs a lot of work. So it's not that and the idea initially, or this money came initially through the 519 Community Center, which is in the Church and Wellesley neighborhood. And essentially, the money had originally been tapped for finding a new LGBTQ sports facility of sorts. But after a while, the mission changed a bit, and it got attached to the possibility of redefining or redesigning, redeveloping the park and the community center. So the whole project was going to be is anonymous. Yeah, and the deal fell apart, so that person anonymity went away. So we don't know. Like, I mean, I could speculate who it is, but it would be a guess.
I thought it was the money came from the city or something.
No, so the idea was that the donor would provide a third of the budget, and then that money would then be matched by the city and maybe the province to do the revitalization. So the total project was going to be about $100 million. The 519 was heavily involved in terms of the organizing of that and thinking through the pre-planning process. So yeah, it would eventually be a partnership between this private donor, the 519 Community Center, which is a community center, but an AOC, so an independent community center of sorts, and Parks, Forestry, and Rec.
So where is the money now?
It's gone. I don't know. They went to. I mean, it's probably a foundation, so they probably contributed to some other cause, but it's not here for this. The current plan for the revitalization is all public funds. all public funds. So the city is paying for it. And there's some key elements, and I'll just go through this pretty quickly in terms of why I was critical of the public-private partnership. One is that, yeah, do you have a question?
Is the 519 still involved?
Is the 519, no, the 519 is not involved anymore. Yeah, so, I mean, there was some differences of vision between, the 519 is a community center, right? And Parks, Forestry, Rec doesn't run community centers, they run recreation centers. So at the time of the consultations in 2015, there were different visions of what that building could be used for. The 519 and the folks that it brought to the consultation were really advocating for a hybrid community center and rec center. That would have been something we don't really have, at least as far as I know of, in terms of the Parks, Forestry, and Rec doesn't run community centers, they run recreational centers. So it would have been a different model. And I think part of what made realizing the Moore Moss Park vision was that working out those details. It's not the only thing. Another thing that made it difficult was that the plan that people came up with through the consultation process was far too expensive. Like it was well over $100 million if they were to do everything that was in that plan, and the budget was just not there to actually accomplish what was proposed or what was discussed. And so those two things, I think, really undermined the viability of the project, and ultimately weren't able to be resolved. And so the donor walked away. And then when the donor walked away, there wasn't enough money to do anything. But it came back because of other things, which we'll get to. But I think, so one of the things, there's three things that I would point to and as things that I found challenging or things that I would take issue with in terms of the Moore Moss Park project. One is that different actors, some from the 519, but also some from the private firm that did the public consultation exercises, acted as if they were the knowledge keepers of social justice rather than a community-based approach. So there was this sort of implementation of a particular type of social justice frameworks without really thinking through how that might be community-based. So there, much of the kind of decision-making about what things should be, what could be included in it, et cetera, was based on this sort of particular claim of social justice that in some ways I would argue is a bit hollow, and I'll get to that in just a moment. The second was that there was this idealization that we should be fixing our parks through philanthropy, like that we should be seeking out private donations to fix parks. I'm not against rich people giving their money to nice causes, but the Moss Park Community Center, John Innes Community Center, is 80 years old. The city should have been able to figure out other routes of revitalizing the park and the community center and the neighborhood without this $30 million from some rich anonymous person. Right? So this idealization of philanthropy, one, takes the city off the hook a bit in terms of its priorities, but also two, allows private individuals or private organizations, I'm not sure which in this case, to direct where funding happens in the city and what projects get prioritized. And so that to me is undermining of a democratic process of decision making and prioritizing neighborhoods based on need, based on all kinds of different criteria that we can think of, and really allows for the private sector to dictate public policy, which is to me very problematic. And then the last one is still a problem today. So the first two go away in some ways because the 519 is no longer involved, and this private donor is off doing something else. But the last one in terms is a framing of Moss Park as being in crisis, in need of intervention. And not just in need of intervention, but because it's a crisis, we can do things a little bit differently there. We don't have to do all the checks and balances. We don't have to do all the things that we might do if it was just a sort of normal process. we can treat it as a crisis situation, and a crisis situation that requires some sort of emergency action rather than a more democratic process. Oops, wrong. Yeah, so this is the social justice one that I went over. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on here because it's not that important. But it's interesting in terms of the 519 being in a new space. The Moss Park is not their neighborhood, not their community. So there was a translation of the expertise that the 519 had developed over the years in the Church and Wellesley neighborhood to another space. And I think that sometimes that translation didn't work perfectly, that there were things that make sense and are and work and are historically accurate and context specific to the Church and Wellesley neighborhood that are not the same in Moss Park, and so not all that translation got lost in some cases, But the 519 folks were the social justice know-how people that were bringing it to the neighborhood. Yeah. No worries. Yeah.
Yeah, so Regent went to the same kind of issues before the vitalization.
Yeah.
Like underserved, left behind with a lot of resources and stuff. And then, but still, Regent Park was NIE.
Yeah.
So how do you advocate for most part to be able to improvement that tie to funding and resources to help that neighborhood?
I think that's a great question, right? So part of it is to have the city recognize Moss Park as a neighborhood would be a good start, right? There's a lot of different definitions of what Moss Park is, but none are fixed in terms of city policy or city conceptions of neighborhoods. So I think part of that would be setting the boundaries and doing demographic studies and doing sort of an actual kind of approach to thinking of Moss Park as its own neighborhood. Moss Park has fairly wealthy neighbors to the north in terms of the Garden District, and fairly wealthy neighbors to the south and to the west. And so in some ways, depending on who's doing the describing of the neighborhood or the boundary making, some of the concentrations of poverty, concentrations of need can get diluted by the Yonge Street Corridor, the Garden District, or the Esplanade, and St. Lawrence Park or St. Lawrence Market neighborhoods, right? So it gets lost, right? So I think part of it has to be to establish what exists, and then part of it has to be some community work that needs to be done. We don't have a neighborhood association, we don't have a business improvement district, we don't have these basic building blocks to do that sort of localized advocacy. Moss Park Coalition is the beginning of that, but we're relatively new. And there just hasn't been the same types of organizing on the ground. So part of it's sort of that grassroots community organizing that takes time and takes energy.
Yeah, I think it's really important what Moss Park Coalition is doing. I wasn't sure why 519 was included in this project because they're from a different neighborhood.
Yeah.
So I feel like if you want to make real change, it has to be within the community by the people belonging in that community, because no one else can speak for that community but themselves.
Yeah.
Right? So.
Yeah, I mean, I think the 519 does great things, right? It's not a critique on the 519 necessarily, but it's just when it'd be like, somebody from Rosedale coming into Regent Park or whatever, right? It's okay, but you have your own things to deal with, right? And so it's just that sort of translation gets lost when you do that kind of work across. But in fairness, there wasn't a community organization or community center or other type of organization that, one, could have attracted a $30 million donation, or two, done the kind of organizing work that they were doing. And this one is pretty straightforward, but this kind of idealization of private funding for public infrastructure has, while one, it's nice because it reduces the burden on taxpayers, it has a lot of other things that are problematic with it. And it was lauded over and over through the Moore Moss Park project.
Sorry, one more question.
Yeah.
So there is a lot of condos popping up on
Yeah.
the Moss Park right now, and I've been seeing for the last couple of years, especially after COVID.
Yeah.
So is there the community benefit that comes tied to that building coming up, or okay?
No. And so this is a good distinction, right? Because a community benefit is different than a philanthropic donation, right? A community benefit, if it's tied to a community benefit agreement or tied to some sort of element of the planning ordinances, some increased density charge, anything along those lines is an obligation that a private sector developer pays into the community as part of their desire to build more densely or higher or whatever rule they're trying to get around. That is fundamentally different than a community foundation or an individual saying, oh, I want to support a park in this neighborhood. And some of the differences have been diluted a bit. So it used to be that that development charges stayed within the same local community. That's changed with some of the new planning practices that our province has instituted recently. But there's other ways to think about community benefits agreements that could be more locally tied. So part of that may be tied to public infrastructure projects like the Ontario Line, which I'll get to in just a moment, or other sorts of projects where it's local hiring that's part of the community benefit, or other sorts of investments within the community. So, I think we should make a clear distinction between a community benefit that is derived because of a community benefits agreement or some other rule versus a philanthropic donation.
Versus what?
A philanthropic donation versus somebody just deciding that they want to give their money to a cause. Because one's an obligation, one's a gift in some ways. So this is where I think the biggest challenge still lies in terms of thinking through redevelopment and community organizing within Moss Park. So crisis framing is a theoretical concept that geographers and sociologists have used to describe the way in which the media in particular, but not just the media, policy can also be involved, works to frame certain places as being in crisis. And once you're in crisis, that means that there needs to be an intervention. And in many cases, it means that you probably aren't the community that can decide your own intervention, right? You're in a crisis situation, you need external help, you need somebody to come in, step in, and intervene. And many times that intervention can be seen as punitive or controlling, right? So in the States, there's examples of this in terms of cities that go bankrupt, and then there's external managers that get appointed to deal with the finances. Detroit is a recent example of that. New York City also went through that in the 1970s. Where it's just like, you are in crisis, you can't deal with your own stuff. We are going to appoint a caretaker to take care of it. The way that it works in planning is a little bit different in that it isn't that we get an external caretaker that imposed on the neighborhood, but some of the processes may get tweaked a bit to deal with or to address the crisis. So community consultations may be changed a bit, or the speed at which intervention happens might be changed a bit. The kind of policing models might be changed a bit to try to address that crisis. But in many cases, these crises are sensationalized, right? They're to describe Moss Park as in crisis because it has a higher poverty rate than the rest of the city would mean that Moss Park has been in perpetual crisis for at least 70 years, right? So it's not that there's chronic conditions that exist within Moss Park that should be addressed, but to describe them as crisis often mutes the types of community-based interventions that can take place. And the...
You think that in reality?
Well, I think...
We must not face it as it is. Let's call it what it is.
Sure, I would be fine with that if the crisis interventions address the underlying causes, right? So I think it's not so much that the label, it's what happens when that label gets placed on it, right? So if the crisis interventions address the root causes of why there is higher rates of poverty or higher rates of addiction or higher rates of premature death in Moss Park, then fine. If we were investing in mental health, if we were investing in job creation, if we were investing in addiction services, all those things that might help to address the underlying causes. If we were thinking about revitalizing the Moss Park apartments that have been, around for 70 plus years, in ways to make them more hospitable and more welcoming to families, sure. But what generally happens is the crisis intervention leads to shallower planning practices. So less community consultation, less community members at the table, higher rates of policing, and not community-based policing, not crisis intervention policing, hard policing, and other things along those lines. So I think it's, sure, we can agree that Moss Park has challenges as a neighborhood.
Yeah, but can I say something?
Yeah, for sure.
The city created that whatever some like houses break down in Regent Park, they bring all the single males there. Either they drink the service or they mentally ill, they cast down there. There's like a lot of families that they don't even let their kids play in the park. They can't, since they can't go to John Island, it's the same. So if the city want to do something, they can do easily, but they don't want to.
So yes, I was just going to ask for an example. When you talked about the gap there.
Yeah.
Give me an example.
A community center, right?
Yeah.
A community center that a park the kids can play in would be good examples. Doing investments in the TCHC stock so that it's not among the more derelict in the city. Like these are basic examples of investments. Toronto Community Housing. Yeah, the housing. Yeah.
They did put in those, in each building there's a space, I don't know what they call it, an addition, like a space for recreation, meetings and stuff. I don't know if you know, but it was done about 20 years ago.
Yeah.
Yeah, so there is.
There's some, but yeah, I think there could be a lot more investment. Yeah.
I have a question. Was Regent Park, I mean, kind of off topic, but was Regent Park considered crisis? And is this whole thing like considered intervention? And so like.
Yeah, I mean, I think you could probably. I'm not the expert on Regent Parks, right? I would probably tell you. I'll have more details, but yeah, I think the Regent Park revitalization was in response to Regent Park being in crisis. The mode of revitalization, so the public-private partnership, the mixed income, community, the private developer involvement, all of that would be things that would have been unique or new or innovations that were born out of a crisis situation. And it was a combination of crisis situations. One, it's a crisis that the city is broke, right? So the city doesn't have a lot of money. And so in order to be able, and hasn't invested in social housing in any real substantive way for 40 years, 30 plus years. And so needed to significantly increase the density of Regent Park through private condos to be able to revitalize the public housing. And yeah, I would say a lot of that had to do with a sense that the neighborhood was in crisis at the time. Yeah. What? Well, that the neighborhood was in crisis at the time of the approval to do the massive redevelopment phases that we're still in, right? We still have a couple left to go.
They didn't put in as much public housing. That's the big problem with Regent Park. It's a great place. They took away a lot of the Regent Park, a lot of the affordable housing.
Right. Yeah. Right. And they, they put in a lot more market rate housing than they put in affordable housing. And as problematic as the green spaces were, they didn't replace green spaces. So it wasn't that they just took them out, right? So there's a really nice park here, but there was a significant loss of green space as well in Regent Park as a part of that deal. So I'm not going to spend any time on this slide. I think it's not really all that important, and I want to get to the work that we're doing now. But essentially, basically, there was a lot of public consultation that happened in the Moss Park process, but it didn't really lead to anything. One, it didn't lead to a revitalization of the community center at all, but it also just didn't lead to a more socially just set of outcomes. And so part of what I would say in closing this section and then moving to what we're doing with Moss Park, or with the Moss Park Coalition, is that the Moss Park process was innovative in really interesting ways. They engaged with a wider swath of the community than generally happens in public participation processes. And this has to do with it being a privately run public consultation. So the person who was giving, or foundation that was giving this money as a donation, also gave quite a bit of money for them to run a really robust community consultation process. And so they were working, did a lot of meetings in John Ennis. They were in the park quite often. They went to the TC8, the Toronto Community Housing Properties. They went to the shelters, and they engaged with lots of different people in terms of vision. And they did it here as well. Yeah, so they did quite extensive work there, and it was quite innovative in terms of the various different methods that they used to try to get people's opinions. But there are quite a few things that I would critique about it. One is that it focused only on the park and the community center. So rather than think about the park and the community center, or the recreational center, sorry, as the heart of the neighborhood, and thinking about it integrated into a wider vision of what Moss Park might be if we took community development seriously, it focused on how might we build a nice building and a nicer park in Moss Park area. Yeah.
So what was the point of that whole community consultation when you already had a plan in place, like creating a community center in the park? Like, what was the whole point of that?
To get the details of that down. Yeah. The second thing, and it's not up here, but the second thing I would say is that in much of the planning processes that exist, not just in Toronto, but everywhere, there's a lack of transparency. So they collect all this data from community consultations. They talk to a lot of people. They have lots of nice photographs of people engaging that they put in their brochures. They create these beautiful diagrams that they print in really large print and put up on walls. But it's not clear ever how any bit of that actually influences the final design. Right? There's no clear translation or no clear thread from the consultation to what ultimately gets proposed as a final design, and nobody can walk it back. So if you ask questions about how did you get to this decision on putting a pool here or whatever it might be, there's no way to connect the two. There's no connecting the dots. So essentially, planning is a black box where people tell a bunch of things to planners or community organizers or whoever is doing it, and then something happens in that black box, and at the end, we get these beautiful renderings of buildings. But it's not clear how those things are connected. And ultimately, the biggest problem with the Moss Park is that it just disappeared. And not only did it just disappear, but there was no communication to community members, to community organizations, to anybody that participated in public consultation. They just stopped communicating. And the website's gone. Like this, I had to find this picture through a web archive because the website is now available for purchase if you want More Moss Park as a domain. But they just completely disappeared off the face of the earth. After years. Well, yeah, sure, but they never bothered to explain. They never bothered to explain. And so one of the things that I've argued to the planners who are involved in that and others is that there is a violence there in terms of getting people's hopes up that there was going to be this investment in the neighborhood and then just disappearing, like completely just walking away from it without any explanation. And that's a privilege, right? That's a privilege to be able to just say, I'm done with this, and I don't have to be accountable to the community in any way. And what I would also say, just one sec, what I also say is that one of the things that we struggle with, and this is, was exacerbated by the pandemic in some ways, is public trust in government. Public trust in the municipality to make decisions that are representative of our neighborhoods, especially our more diverse neighborhoods, to think that we're being heard or listened to by our city councilors, by our deputations, by our community consultation processes. And it makes it that much harder to get people to engage in community development discussions when they were burned pretty badly by one not that many years ago. The public consultation for the new version of the revitalization of John Ennis, all online. I get that there's some concerns about safety, I guess, but very poorly attended. Like there's hundreds of people that came out to More Moss Park conversations. The last conversation I was at with the folks at Parks, Forestry, and Rec, I think there were 12 people, 3 of which were from Parks, Forestry, and Rec. So it's just paled in comparison. And there's a lot of reasons why that is, but one of the reasons I think has to be a loss of trust. Yeah.
Yeah, so I was, you mentioned a little bit about the change of the government, like moving, the city councilor moving, or elected representative moving, that might have that Christine Montan was city councilor and moving from her position, maybe do you think that will impact the process of the consultation? Because she was kind of advocating a bit, kind of.
I think that's part of it. I also think that the public consultation that happened with More Moss Park was privately funded, so there was more money to do lots of different things, hire different people, have a separate website, versus the current process is all internal to Parks, Forestry, and Rec, and they just do things a little bit differently and have a different budget. They have a different, smaller consultation team. Yeah, I think...
Did the donor make mistakes the way they did it?
Yeah.
So, just a question. Because there's a YSM, they do community organizing too.
Yeah.
And they, they encourage community, and they have a lead that will help organize or, give guidance, right?
Yeah.
Is there any, or agencies or nonprofit that is also in the neighborhood to help guide there?
Yeah.
Well, ISM we work with a little bit. There's Building Roots is also in the neighborhood. Fred Victor is there. There's lots of organizations, but they're not community. Building Roots is a little bit different because it is a kind of community development organization. Fred Victor is focused largely on client care, right? So it's a little bit different in terms of its orientation. Yeah.
There was a neighborhood information post.
Yeah, neighborhood information post.
Because if people, I think we should more awareness of what they can do as people, right? And then that will force the agencies kind of push them to do more work with the people.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, and I think that's what we're trying to work towards. Yeah.
Because if you come full force with an idea or with an advocacy, that will help them with the work that they're doing.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. So, yes, and I think we'll get there. And that's what. So.
Just tell us what to look up for the new concept. You said there's something about the community center.
Oh, the new community center. Let me see if I have. It is John Ennis. Yeah. So. If you just look up Moss Park improvements and John Ennis Community Center, there's I can give it to you afterwards. Yeah.
Was this lecture mentioned in Moss Park as well?
This?
Yes.
Well, I work with the Moss Park Coalition, so I talk to them regularly. I haven't done one at John Ennis in a bit, but yeah, I'm in Moss Park all the time.
But I think non-involvement is happening so much about Moss Park.
Yeah.
Representation is missing.
Yeah.
When representation is missing, allocation is missing. So, this is...
What's missing?
We need another Soraya there.
What?
When you don't come, everything is allocated to you. That's what politics is.
Yeah.
When you are missing.
When you're missing.
If the people aren't involved.
Aren't making demands, etc.
No question
I
about
think we could train Moss Park people.
Yeah.
We are training.
They haven't told us.
You know, she's the next.
We don't even
Yeah.
know about the new project.
Yeah, so I'll talk about it now. The Moss Park Coalition largely formed because of things that were happening in the neighborhood around the Ontario Line intervention. So Ontario Line will have a stop in Moss Park, in the park itself. So just south of the hockey rink, there'll be a station.
I don't think anybody could.
You can't miss it, right? And so there's lots of concerns about the way in which Metrolinx decides to do their thing, and I think we can all agree that Metrolinx doesn't have the best community engagement of a public organization.
Where's the station?
So this would be the Queen station, or the Moss Park station, right here. Yeah, so that is Queen and Sherbourne, the corner of Queen and Sherbourne. And so the coalition formed with the idea of trying to make changes to the way that the Moss Park station was being planned. Those changes, I think we can point to two, but Elena and David could maybe add to it if they want to. One was concerns about the destruction of the park itself, right? So I think a lot of people in the neighborhood coalesced together because of the number of trees that have been just cut down in the park. Not for the station, but for parking trucks. It's unbelievable, right? It's absolutely unbelievable.
A spot where people could sit, homeless people were using that space.
And old trees too, right? Like mature trees cut down because they wanted a place for their trucks to park.
Of course, they're going to move the shelters, so they'll probably not need them.
So
Where was that exactly?
So that happened all along Queen Street, between Sherbourne and Jarvis. And it happened on a Saturday morning, I know because I was going to yoga, so it was Saturday morning quite early, in a snowstorm. So they did it, they just did it. They just decided that this was the day that there's probably going to be less people watching, and decided to just mow them down and did it. So that was one issue. And the second is that Metrolinx agreed to a whole bunch of community benefits as part of their funding from the federal government, from the provincial government. And yet, consistently sign contracts with contractors that don't have any community benefits built into them. They just don't care. It's not a thing that they bothered to negotiate. These are billions of dollars of contracts that they just didn't even try to meet their community benefit agreement obligations. And those community benefit agreement obligations are about local hiring, about training of local people, about a number of equity seeking or equity deserving groups who are represented in their hiring. So women, people of color, indigenous folks, etc. So those two things were like, what's really happening here, right? You have a transit line that's going to cost $17 billion or something along those lines. Obviously, not all of that's being spent in Moss Park, but you have a significant portion of it being spent in Moss Park. You have very little public face or very little public consultation, and you're not even going to bother with the pretty small community benefits agreements that you were mandated to do. So that's where we came together as a coalition and to start to advocate for different ways of doing things. And one of the things that we tried to advocate for was that if you're going to build a community center, you're going to build a station, and you're probably at some point going to revitalize the hockey rink in between, why are you doing this separately? Why are you doing these as different projects? There's got to be efficiencies in terms of space. So opening up more green space for the neighborhood if you combine these buildings. And there's got to be benefits in terms of other types of processes, efficiencies, et cetera, that could, if you just talk to each other and do this more collectively. And the other was really to think through what else could be used in this building that they're building besides just a glass enclosure of a subway stop, right? Downtown subways mostly don't have big stations attached to them. For whatever reason, Moss Park will have a station. Unlike other stops on the line, because it's in a park, it's not going to be connected to housing. So housing doesn't get built in parks. So they're just building a station just by itself that all it will be a staircase down to a subway. Using up a whole bunch of space in a public park, in a place that has a limited number of parks and green space. Makes no sense at all. But they're also completely immune to public consultation, right? The province doesn't care about public consultation. Metrolinx doesn't care about public consultation. Nobody's holding them accountable, so they're completely immune to that. And this is what I mentioned in terms of the park redevelopment, in terms of what the city is doing in terms of park redevelopment. They've done public consultations, and they're in, well, supposedly they'll hire a constructor this year and build the park by 2030. That's if you believe that Metrolinx will be done on time. So it's probably, I would give it 5 to 10 years beyond this in terms of the community center that's being built. But again, it's being envisioned as a different building than the arena, or the station, and it's being envisioned as a recreation center rather than a community center. So not only through all this investment of billions of dollars in transit and millions of dollars in park redesign and station redevelopment, we still won't have a community center in the neighborhood. This is not a thing that anybody is investing in, nor even talking about. So here's where we get to the Moss Park Coalition. So Moss Park Coalition, as I've said multiple times, group of community folks trying to think through, first trying to get Metrolinx to be more accountable to its obligations and to the community itself, but more broadly, and I think this is partially where we've hit a lot of walls with Metrolinx, we've started to think about how do we actually mobilize community power? How do we actually start to create a framework where all development, not just Metrolinx, not just John Ennis, but all development, public and private, is leveraged for community development. And that is a reflection on the fact that much of what we're hearing in terms of development in the neighborhood imagines a different population of people living in Moss Park than the current population. Imagines that the things that need to be built are for this new, wealthier, more established group of people. I think so.
Have they got it?
They're not yet, but I think that's what the goal is, right? It's to displace the current folks. And so rather than actually treat the crisis, if we agree that there's a crisis, rather than actually treat the issues of poverty, unemployment, addiction, etc., it's build rich people's houses and hope that they take over the neighborhood and that the poor, the people living in actually somewhat affordable housing might move out. Those places get torn down and build new things like that, right? We saw the tip of that fight at 230 Sherborne, you know, in terms of that property fight that's still ongoing. That's just the beginning of that type of transition of affordable, not great, but affordable housing being bought up by developers for the hopes that a new luxury market will be built in. And so we're worried about what happens to our neighbors, right? What happens to the people who live and work and otherwise stay in Moss Park. And part of what we're trying to think through is what is a local solution for community development within the neighborhood. So there's lots of models that exist in terms of social development plans or other sorts of community development plans. Regent Park is a good example. TCBN's work on community benefits agreements are a good example. Parkdale has obviously done work in terms of their community development plan. Jane and Finch has its own community development plan. These are all developed within the context of these specific neighborhoods, right? So the Regent Park Social Development Plan, which people in this room are better experts than me on, is funded because of all of the development that's happened within the neighborhood, right? So all the rich development, but it's given money to the social development plan that can be then mobilized for community priorities. We don't have that sort of situation, or at least not systemically, or a systematic plan in Moss Park. So everything's happening one by one, and nobody's being required to pay in to a social development plan in Moss Park. And it's difficult to imagine how that changes because we don't have the same master plan situation that happened here in Regent Park. Same is true in other places. There's different realities that exist in each neighborhood in terms of what's possible and what funding might be able to exist. And so we're trying to figure out what might work for the neighborhood. The second is that because there isn't anchor organizations and like this organization and others to do the types of grassroots community development in Moss Park in the same way as in other neighborhoods, we don't have enough data really to document the community needs and concerns. We know what they are pretty well, I think, because we talk to communities quite a bit, but we haven't done a systematic community consultation process to really document it in a formalized way. And so that's probably our next step. And then the last is to build a framework. It's not going to be the level of a community development plan that you have here in Regent Park just yet, but what we would like is to articulate the priorities that we hear through the community process and try to figure out how to build in accountability mechanisms so that new development does pay in to these types of things or does contribute to community development in important ways. And I'm saying new development, not just private sector, but also public sector new development thinks about community development as an investment. So here are some examples. Building a Better Fairview, the Parkdale Community Benefits Framework that we're trying to learn from, and then pretty quickly we'll start to get into a community engagement process. And then a couple of other examples, Community Benefits Agreement, which you all know about, so I'm not going to read, but gives you a sense of, or gives a sense of how investment in infrastructure ought to be tied to not just infrastructure as a development tool, as a kind of infrastructure development tool, but can also be tied to community benefits, to work, forest development, et cetera. Social development planning, which we're learning a lot from the folks in Regent Park about, but really thinking through how to amplify local voices in trying to rein in, but not necessarily limit, but to rein in and to shape neighborhood change. So we're not arrogant enough to believe that we can to control or limit the amount of neighborhood change that's going to happen in Moss Park, the amount of investment that's going to happen in the neighborhood publicly and privately. The new subway line will be a catalyst for all kinds of land speculation and development, and there's nothing to stop that. We can't stop that. What we're arguing is that it should be done in a way, as much as possible, that considers the social context and social development. And so, so it's really about thinking through how to link the people who are there now to the benefits that are accrued from this type of investment. So this is where we are at in terms of our community engagement. We had a group of my students this past year come up with a community development engagement plan for us. And so they did lots of research in the neighborhood, but also research in all kinds of different examples to learn from, and proposed a community engagement plan that we will work to implement over the next year. And what it's really meant for us to do is to articulate, identify, and document neighborhood priorities, document the change that we're already seeing within the neighborhood, and begin to strategize on what a framework might look like. So what are the things that we might demand be included in a development vision a social development vision for the neighborhood? 2 more slides and then we can have a conversation for as long as you guys want. We've talked about this quite a bit in terms of challenges. Moss Park doesn't have the same social infrastructure that other places have. We don't have a community center. We don't have a lot of organizations that are doing this type of community development work. There are a lot of social service organizations in the neighborhood, but they're very specific in terms of their causes, whether it's addiction, whether it's homelessness, whether it's people who are coming out of prison and needing to be... some are racially divided, but most are integrated. There's a few that are racially specific, but most are quite integrated. But they're very specific in terms of their issue that they're dealing with. Give me an example. Yeah, so they work on homelessness issues, or they work on people who need safe injection sites, or they work on mental health for crisis, things like that. They're very issue specific rather than community development, right? So Building Roots is a great example, does some community development, but really is about getting healthy food, healthy appropriate food into the neighborhood as much as possible. Yeah?
Building Roots, most of the work they do is not most about tenants, you know that, right?
Yeah. So yeah, they work largely with the Moss Park apartments.
Most of the tenants, like most of the people who come get the vegetable are not from Moss Park, most of it like 70%, I know for a fact. They try to like get their list, have the list, their names, so they will get it aside instead of like Moss Park. They don't do outreach in Moss Park. A lot of people don't even know that they do the vegetable.
Don't they have a dinner too, like once a week or something?
And that doesn't ask which Moss Park? Oh.
Most people don't even know they have the vegetables there.
Well, they can.
And the people who line up there have with their from Moss Park.
Oh, jeez.
A lot of people don't know. They also have workshops. I even have took a workshop online.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean,
It's not geared to. I think they do as much as they can.
I think so too, and that's the other thing. I think
security is really good. They have people lining up to get bags of groceries. And I'm sure that word has gotten out because I've seen it.
Yeah, I wouldn't say any bad words about the organizations that exist in Moss Park. They're just very specific to their causes, and they're needed for sure, but they're not doing community development work.
Are they part of your coalition? Building Roots?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, it's not a critique of them.
I want to have a clarification. Are they NIA neighborhood in Moss Park or no? No? Okay. So, but there's TCH residents there, right? So that means, because I remember when they started, they had TCH personnel who engaged the public and gathered their, concerns, and they develop this kind of like engagement activities for people, and include, invite everyone that wants to be involved, who wants to be part of community engagement, or who wants to be in the safety. I remember that at the at this one of the building there.
Yeah.
So that's
Yeah, we will definitely, yeah, we're partnering with TCH. And we will work with them in terms of the community, ramping out of the community engagement plan, for sure. Like that's a fundamental core of our population.
have like a central that, like will unite other agencies.
Yeah. And we've started to do that work, for sure. But what I would say is that basically the point I'm trying to make is that there isn't a community center, there isn't a neighborhood association, or even a business improvement area or association. There isn't these types of things that work on neighborhood scale challenges other than the Moss Park Coalition.
Well, Michelle Daniels did a lot of that for Regent Park.
Yeah, that's true. Okay. And then, and the pace of development is also pretty high. So there's lots of public and private investment within the neighborhood. It's not coordinated. It doesn't have a lot of community benefits sketched into it. It doesn't have a lot of even affordable housing built into it. But it's continuing very rapidly. So we're in the midst of all this change. So that makes things a little bit challenging.
Public investment is there? I don't know any public investment.
Well, the John Innes Community Center, if it happens, and which it should, and Metrolinx is also public money. It's our money. It's public investment. And there's also George Street revitalization. There's quite a few projects. The George Street revitalization. It's on pause, but it's in the neighborhood.
I live on George Street. Where is it? You mean at Queen?
Yeah.
Just be higher up.
So things a bit higher. Yeah.
Are we, thank you very much for this conversation. Is it possible to have a copy?
Yeah, sure.
Who are interested?
Yeah, I have my card, so you can just email me and I can send it to you. Yeah, and then what I would say is that there currently hasn't been a lot of municipal scale support for the coalition work, and I'll just leave it there at that. But there's some opportunities, and one is that there are great examples in the city to learn from. So we have friends here in Regent Park, obviously, in Jane and Finch, in Fairview, in lots of places in Parkdale, lots of communities that have already done this work that we're learning from quite a bit and that we're engaged with quite a bit. So we're not reinventing the wheel by any stretch of the imagination, and so I think that puts us in a good space in terms of where to start. The affordability crisis is not just a Moss Park thing. It is well documented in Toronto. There's lots of engagement now about affordable housing. We'll see what comes of it. But there's lots of engagement at all three scales of government around affordability crisis, affordable housing. We hope that translates to some thinking about what that might mean for Moss Park. And Moss Park is a vibrant community. There are lots of people there that care about Moss Park, that are concerned about the changes that are happening, that are angry about the loss of the trees still, and have a lot of potential to be mobilized. I think the work to mobilize them hasn't been done. It's something that we're starting to do as a coalition, but the people potential is there, and the energy is there. It's just a matter of finding the work and the right way of doing it.
Why did they cut down the trees?
As Metrolinx decided to do it, right? Like it's hard to get a straight answer from Metrolinx. So their rationale is that they needed a place to park their construction vehicles.
Said that, I remember. That's incredible.
Yeah.
And where did their trucks go?
It's like a parking lot for the construction on the line. So yeah.
But they have like this armory land over there, which is like a huge land where there's parking also.
Yeah, they didn't want to pay for private parking.
And it's isn't that where our tennis court?
Isn't that the city's land? Or is it like private?
There's federal land that's right there, the armory. that they didn't figure out how to negotiate.
Because that's a huge piece of land.
It is.
No one.
Yeah, with the big fence around it. Yeah.
I remember.
Yeah. Or no one. Queen and.
Near City Hall.
No, in Moss Park, just to the west of Moss Park. This is the Armory. Jarvis and Queen, yeah.
On the other side is a shooter street.
Yeah, there's an armory and then there's like a big fenced off.
Yeah, all over the shooter, Jarvis, and Queen.
So about the trees.
Yeah.
If they're really like angry and want to advocate for the trees, because I remember when I was taking IWIP, and we had a person that came and talking about advocating for putting more trees in the city.
Yeah.
Because there's actually a study that someone can, or not someone, but they calculate how much trees needed to for people to still be able to breathe properly. I don't know the correct word, but there was a person who came here in Korea that they calculate that maybe you can use that dialogue to the city that we need more trees in this neighborhood so that people can live. That supports well-being.
Yeah.
Quality of the air.
Yeah, quality of air and stuff like that.
Yeah.
Then we have our from the city.
Well, the city even has a mandate.
Yeah, like just need
Yeah, I agree with you. I think the challenge with these particular trees is the same challenge as the Osgood Hall trees, right? It was the province making the decision, and they're just harder to convince. Yeah.
Well, if there's experts that can back that up, I guess if they take down or they take out trees, then they have to replace it somewhere else.
Maybe, yeah.
Or incorporate it in the planning.
Yeah. I think the one of the big challenges with trees is when you take down mature trees and then you replace it with baby trees. It's like, yeah. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much.
So I'm happy to stick around and answer, have a dialogue about this, but that's where my formal presentation ends. So
I'm really happy you came. That's wonderful.
thank you.
We are very lucky.
Yeah, it's so good.
Too bad there weren't more people. I don't know.
It's a Leafscape, I guess. Maybe that's part of it.
Maybe we can just add if anybody wants to learn more that the Moss Park Coalition meets every Thursday morning. We're always happy to have people come out.
And where do you meet?
Online right now.
You meet online?
Morning?
Can you say the email address or something for the camera so I can put it in the video? How to connect with the coalition?
So Moss Park Coalition at gmail.com.
Yeah, mossparkcoalition@gmail.com. People can also email me and I can connect you with that too.
Where?
Yeah, g.roberts@utoronto.ca. And my card's here.
So yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Don't forget to like, comment, share, and subscribe to our YouTube channel. And please follow us on our social media platform. For more information, you can check out our website.